The Galactic Academy's xenobiology classroom buzzed with nervous energy as students from 17 different species settled into their bioadaptive chairs. The morning light of Kepler 442b's twin suns streamed through the crystalline walls, casting rainbow patterns across the polished floor. At the far corner of the room, Sarah Chen sat quietly, her worn leather jacket a stark contrast to the sleek biosuits worn by her classmates. She had arrived at the Academy 3 months ago as part of the first human exchange program, representing the newly discovered species from the planet humans simply called Earth. The other students still whispered about her homeworld whenever they thought she couldn't hear. They called it a Deathworld, a classification reserved for planets so hostile that any species evolving there would be considered apex predators by galactic standards. Sarah didn't mind the whispers. She understood their fear. Earth was indeed classified as a Class 12 death world, the highest rating on the Galactic Threat Assessment Scale. Most of her classmates came from garden worlds, where the most dangerous creature was equivalent to Earth's butterflies. They couldn't comprehend a planet where massive predators roamed freely, where natural disasters could level entire continents, and where the dominant species had clawed its way to the top of the food chain through sheer determination and adaptability. Professor Veltar, a graceful Zephyrian with translucent blue skin and 4 delicate arms, began the day's lesson on defensive mechanisms in hostile environments. The other students took notes on their neural interfaces, while Sarah preferred the primitive method of pen and paper, another quirk that made her classmates uncomfortable. She had learned that most galactic species had abandoned physical tools centuries ago, relying instead on technology integrated directly into their biology. Today we shall examine how various species have adapted to survive in environments that pose significant threats to their survival, Professor Veltar announced, her melodious voice carrying easily through the room. We will begin with the Korathian spinebacks of Gamma Centauri, who developed natural armor plating to protect against their planet's acidic rainstorms. As the professor activated the holographic display, showing a creature that looked remarkably similar to Earth's armadillos, Sarah noticed something was wrong. Kex Hai, a Valtorian student who sat 3 rows ahead, was moving strangely. His normally smooth gray skin had taken on a darker hue, and his breathing had become erratic. Among the Valtorians, this was a sign of extreme agitation or territorial aggression. Sarah had studied the behavioral patterns of all the major galactic species before arriving at the Academy. It was a survival skill she had learned growing up on Earth, where understanding the warning signs of dangerous animals could mean the difference between life and death. Her human instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution on a world where everything wanted to kill her ancestors, were now screaming that something was very wrong. Kex Hai's movements became more pronounced. His elongated fingers, which ended in retractable claws, began to twitch rhythmically. Sarah recognized the pattern from her xenobiology texts. It was a pre-attack sequence, a biological imperative that Valtorians couldn't consciously control when their territorial instincts were triggered. The other students remained oblivious, their attention focused on the professor's lecture about evolutionary adaptations. None of them had grown up in an environment where constant vigilance was necessary for survival. They had never needed to develop the hyper-awareness that came naturally to humans from death worlds. Sarah's hand moved slowly to her pocket, where she kept a small multi-tool her father had given her before she left Earth. It was primitive by galactic standards, but humans had always been tool users, and old habits died hard. She didn't reach for it yet, but knowing it was there provided comfort. Professor Veltar continued her lecture, now discussing the chemical defenses employed by the Catherian bloom pods, when Kex Hai suddenly stood up. His movement was fluid but aggressive, and Sarah could see the predatory grace that his species had evolved during their time as pack hunters on their homeworld of Valter Prime. "Professor," HFY said, his voice carrying the guttural undertones that indicated a Valtorian was entering a combat state. I wish to demonstrate a point about Deathworld adaptations. The professor looked pleased, unaware of the danger signs that Sarah was reading in HFY's posture and coloration. Certainly, HFY, please share your insight with the class. HFY reached into his equipment pouch and withdrew what appeared to be a ceremonial Valtorian blade, a curved weapon that Sarah recognized from her cultural studies. The weapon was beautiful, with intricate etchings along its surface, but it was also deadly sharp and designed specifically for close-quarters combat. I believe, HFY said, his voice now carrying the full weight of Valtorian aggression, that this human has been given far too much credit for her species' supposed superiority. I propose we test whether a Deathworlder can truly handle a threat when faced with one. The classroom fell silent. Several students gasped, and Professor Veltar's forearms began to flutter in distress, a clear sign of fear among her species. The Zephyrians were pacifists by nature, and the concept of violence in an academic setting was completely foreign to them. Sarah remained seated, her expression unchanged. She had faced worse threats during her morning jogs through the Amazon rainforest back on Earth. A single agitated alien with a knife was concerning, but not panic-inducing for someone who had once stared down a hungry jaguar armed with nothing but a hiking stick and determination. HFY, Professor Veltar said, her voice trembling. Please put the weapon away. Violence is strictly forbidden in Academy spaces. But HFY was beyond reason. His species' territorial instincts had taken over, triggered by what he perceived as a challenge to Valtorian dominance. In his current state, he would see any attempt at de-escalation as weakness, and any show of fear would only make him more aggressive. Sarah watched as HFY began to move toward her desk, the blade held in a traditional Valtorian combat grip. The other students scrambled away from their seats, some calling for help on their neural communicators while others simply fled the classroom entirely. Professor Veltar had backed against the wall, her delicate frame trembling with terror. This was exactly the kind of situation that humans had evolved to handle. Not the specific scenario of an alien with a knife in a space classroom, but the fundamental problem of a predator threatening pack members. Sarah's ancestors had faced down cave bears, saber-toothed cats, and rival human tribes with nothing but primitive weapons and cunning. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Every human action was being broadcast to the rest of the galaxy through the Academy's recording systems. And she knew that how she handled this situation would determine how her entire species was perceived by the galactic community. HFY, she said, her voice calm and steady. I understand you're feeling threatened, but this isn't the way to prove your point. The Valtorian hissed, a sound that would have sent most galactic species running in terror. To Sarah, it sounded like an angry house cat. She had grown up on a world where the local wildlife included creatures that could bite through steel and predators that hunted in coordinated packs. A single upset alien, regardless of how dangerous his species might be, simply didn't register as a significant threat. HFY lunged forward with the blade, moving faster than most galactic species could track. But humans had evolved as pursuit predators, capable of tracking and responding to threats moving at high speeds. Sarah's reflexes, enhanced by years of surviving on a death world, kicked in automatically. She sidestepped the attack with minimal movement, her body flowing out of the blade's path like water. The motion was so smooth and effortless that it looked almost casual, as if she had simply decided to take a step to the left for no particular reason. HFY stumbled past her, his momentum carrying him beyond his intended target. He spun around, confusion replacing some of the aggression in his posture. In his species' traditional combat scenarios, opponents either fled in terror or met attacks head-on with their own aggressive displays. Sarah's response was something entirely outside his evolutionary programming. "That's an interesting technique," Sarah said conversationally, as if they were discussing homework rather than engaged in potentially lethal combat. "Valtorian blade work emphasizes speed and intimidation, doesn't it? Very effective against prey species, I imagine." Her casual tone had an unexpected effect on HFY. Valtorian aggression was designed to overwhelm opponents through displays of dominance and ferocity. When those displays failed to generate the expected fear response, their biological programming didn't have a clear next step. Sarah continued speaking, her voice maintaining the same calm, educational tone that Professor Veltar might use during a lecture. "The curved design of your blade is optimized for slashing attacks rather than thrusting, which makes sense for a species that evolved to hunt in open grasslands where mobility would be essential." She began to move around the classroom, not away from HFY, but in a slow circle that kept her at an optimal distance from his weapon. Her movement pattern was instinctive, based on millions of years of human evolution spent avoiding and countering threats from multiple angles. "Of course," she continued, "that design philosophy does create some limitations in confined spaces like this classroom. The ceiling height restricts your overhead strikes, and the furniture placement limits your ability to build momentum for your attacks." HFY made another lunge, this time attempting to corner her against a bank of computer terminals. Sarah flowed around the attack again, this time using one of the desks as a pivot point to redirect his momentum. The Valtorian crashed into the terminal, his blade embedding itself in the bioplastic surface. As he struggled to free his weapon, Sarah walked over to the classroom's emergency supply cabinet. Every academy classroom was equipped with basic safety equipment, including restraint fields designed to contain dangerous specimens during xenobiology demonstrations. "The interesting thing about Deathworld evolution," she said, retrieving a small device from the cabinet, "is that it doesn't just produce physical adaptations. It also selects for psychological traits like pattern recognition, threat assessment, and strategic thinking." She activated the restraint field generator, and a shimmering energy barrier appeared around HFY. The field was designed to contain even the most aggressive alien specimens, and it had no trouble holding one confused and increasingly frustrated Valtorian. "For example," Sarah continued, returning to her desk and sitting down as if nothing had happened, "humans evolved on a world where predators often used intimidation displays before attacking. We learned to read those displays and respond appropriately, rather than simply running away or fighting back immediately." Professor Veltar had emerged from her corner, her forearms still trembling, but her scientific curiosity beginning to override her fear. "How did you know he was going to attack before he revealed the weapon?" Sarah pulled out her notebook and began writing, her pen moving steadily across the paper. "Valtorian skin coloration changes are tied to their emotional states. The darkening pattern he displayed is consistent with territorial aggression. Additionally, the finger-twitching pattern is a pre-combat sequence that most Valtorians can't consciously control." She looked up at the trapped alien, who had stopped struggling against the restraint field and was now staring at her with what appeared to be a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. "The real question," Sarah said, "is why HFY felt threatened enough to trigger his territorial response in the first place. Valtorians are normally quite good at suppressing those instincts in social settings." Campus security arrived a few minutes later, their hover platforms equipped with advanced containment systems designed to handle any species in the galaxy. They seemed almost disappointed to find that the situation had already been resolved by what they considered a primitive Deathworlder using basic classroom equipment. As they led HFY away for psychological evaluation and treatment, he looked back at Sarah with an expression that she couldn't quite read. Among his species, being defeated in combat by a superior opponent was not a source of shame, but rather an opportunity for learning and growth. "Human Sarah," he called out as the security team guided him toward the exit. "I would be honored to study your combat techniques in a controlled environment, should you be willing to instruct me." Sarah smiled, the first emotion she had shown throughout the entire encounter. "I'd be happy to help, Kexhai. But next time, maybe we could start with the theory before moving to the practical application." After the security team left, Professor Veltar approached Sarah's desk cautiously. The other students who had fled were beginning to return, their curiosity overcoming their fear as word spread that the situation had been resolved without violence. "Sarah," the professor said, her melodious voice still carrying traces of nervousness, "I feel I must ask. Was that display representative of typical human defensive capabilities?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She didn't want to overstate human abilities, but she also didn't want to give the impression that Earth species were helpless victims despite their Deathworld origins. "Professor," she said finally, "what you saw today was pretty standard for any human who grew up in a moderately dangerous environment. Most of my classmates back on Earth could have handled that situation just as easily, probably better." The classroom fell silent again as the implications of that statement sank in. If a single human exchange student could neutralize a Valtorian combat threat without breaking a sweat, what did that say about the species as a whole? Professor Veltar's 4 arms fluttered nervously as she processed this information. "And how many humans are there on your homeworld?" Sarah's smile widened slightly. "About 8 billion. Give or take." The professor's translucent blue skin went noticeably paler. News of the classroom incident spread through the Galactic Academy faster than a quantum transmission. Within hours, representatives from dozens of species were requesting detailed reports about the human students' response to the Valtorian threat. The Academy's Xenobiology department found itself inundated with requests for interviews, psychological evaluations, and combat demonstrations. Sarah Chen sat in Dean Thaxmore's office, watching the elderly Arcturian's tentacles writhe with nervous energy as he reviewed the security footage for the 5th time. The Dean's species was known for their methodical approach to problem-solving, but the implications of what he was seeing clearly had him rattled. "Miss Chen," Dean Thaxmore said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through 3 centuries of academic leadership, "I must confess that your species continues to surprise us. The Galactic Council's initial assessment classified humans as a potential Class 7 threat based on your homeworld's danger rating. After today's events, I fear that classification may need to be revised." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had come to the Academy to learn about galactic civilization and to represent humanity as peaceful explorers eager to join the greater community of intelligent species. The last thing she wanted was for her people to be classified as a galactic threat based on her response to a single agitated classmate. "Dean Thaxmore," she said carefully, "I hope you understand that my reaction today was purely defensive. Humans don't seek out conflict, but we are prepared to handle it when it finds us." The Dean's primary tentacle tapped rhythmically against his desk. A gesture Sarah had learned indicated deep thought among his species. "That may be precisely what concerns the Council, Miss Chen. Most species in the galaxy have evolved beyond the need for individual combat capabilities. We rely on technology, social structures, and collective decision-making to resolve conflicts. The idea that an entire species retains the ability to engage in personal combat is unsettling to many of our member worlds." Through the office's transparent walls, Sarah could see groups of students gathered in the courtyard below, their animated discussions clearly focused on the morning's events. She recognized several of her classmates among them, including Zerath, a young crystalline whose silicon-based physiology made her one of the most physically fragile students at the academy. "If I may ask," Sarah said, "what exactly is the Council's concern? Are they afraid that humans will become aggressive toward other species?" Dean Thaxmore's tentacles stilled, a sign that he was choosing his words very carefully. "Miss Chen, in the past 3,000 years of galactic civilization, there have been fewer than a dozen recorded instances of individual combat between sapient species. Most conflicts are resolved through diplomatic channels, economic pressure, or collective action by the galactic peacekeeping force. The idea that a single individual could neutralize a physical threat without technological assistance is foreign to most of our societies." Sarah was beginning to understand the scope of the cultural gap between humans and the rest of galactic civilization. Earth species had developed in an environment where individual survival skills were paramount, while most other intelligent species had evolved in circumstances that favored cooperation over personal combat ability. "Dean," she said, "I think there may be a fundamental misunderstanding about human nature. We're not a warrior species in the sense that we seek out combat for its own sake. We're survivors. Everything about our evolution has been shaped by the need to adapt to threats and overcome challenges. That doesn't make us aggressive, it makes us resilient." Before the dean could respond, his communication terminal chimed with an urgent message. As he read the display, his tentacles began to writhe more rapidly, a clear sign of distress. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice taking on a formal tone, "I've just received a directive from the Galactic Council. They're requesting a full demonstration of human defensive capabilities, to be conducted under controlled conditions with representatives from the major species present. The demonstration is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The request sounded reasonable on the surface, but she suspected there was more to it than simple scientific curiosity. "Dean, may I ask what form this demonstration is expected to take?" The dean's reluctance to answer was obvious from his body language. "The council has requested that you face progressively more challenging scenarios, beginning with simulated environmental hazards and culminating in controlled combat situations against trained opponents from various species." The true scope of what was being asked began to dawn on Sarah. The Galactic Council wasn't simply interested in understanding human capabilities. They were trying to assess whether her species represented a potential threat to galactic security. The demonstration would essentially be a test to determine if humans should be allowed full membership in galactic civilization, or if they should be classified as too dangerous for peaceful coexistence. "I see," Sarah said quietly. "And if I refuse to participate?" Dean Thaxmore's tentacles drooped with what Sarah recognized as sadness. "The Council has indicated that humanity's application for galactic membership would be indefinitely postponed pending further evaluation. Your people would remain isolated on Earth until the Council could develop alternative methods for assessing your species' threat potential." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. The future of humanity's relationship with the galaxy rested on her performance in a series of tests designed by species who had no real understanding of human nature or capabilities. If she performed poorly, humans might be dismissed as primitives unworthy of galactic membership. If she performed too well, they might be classified as dangerous predators to be contained or eliminated. "Dean," she said finally, "I'll participate in the demonstration. But I'd like to request permission to contact my homeworld first. If I'm going to represent humanity in this capacity, I think my people deserve to know what's at stake." The dean nodded gravely. "Of course, Miss Chen. The Academy will provide full communication access to Earth. I should also inform you that Professor Veltar has volunteered to serve as your advocate during the proceedings. Despite this morning's events, She believed strongly in humanity's potential for peaceful integration into galactic society. As Sarah left the dean's office, she found herself thinking about the strange path that had brought her to this moment. 3 months ago, she had been a graduate student in xenobiology at Berkeley, studying theoretical alien life forms that humanity had never expected to encounter. Now she was about to undergo trials that would determine the future of her entire species. The communication center was located in the Academy's central spire, a massive tower that housed the most advanced technology available to galactic civilization. The quantum entanglement communicators could establish real-time contact with any point in the galaxy, a feat that still seemed like magic to someone from a species that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. As the connection to Earth stabilized, Sarah found herself looking at the familiar face of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead scientist for humanity's first contact program. Dr. Rodriguez had been her mentor throughout the selection process for the exchange program, and seeing her now brought a sense of comfort that Sarah hadn't realized she needed. "Sarah," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying clearly across the light years between them. "We've been monitoring the Academy's public communications channels. Are you all right?" Sarah smiled despite the circumstances. Even across the vastness of space, her mentor's first concern was for her well-being rather than the political implications of the situation. "I'm fine, Elena," she said. "But we have a problem. The Galactic Council wants to conduct a formal assessment of human capabilities, and I'm afraid the results could determine whether our species is accepted as a peaceful member of galactic civilization or classified as a potential threat." Dr. Rodriguez's expression grew serious as Sarah explained the details of the upcoming demonstration. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence as the implications sank in. "Sarah," Dr. Rodriguez said finally, "I want you to understand that whatever happens tomorrow, Earth stands behind you. You've already accomplished more than we ever dreamed possible by simply being accepted at the Academy. If the Council cannot see past their fears to recognize humanity's potential as allies, then perhaps galactic civilization isn't ready for us yet." The words provided some comfort, but Sarah knew that the stakes were too high for her to simply walk away from the challenge. Humanity had dreamed of joining the galactic community for generations, and she wasn't going to be the one to close that door. "Elena," she said, "I need you to send me everything we have on human physical and psychological capabilities. If I'm going to represent our species in these trials, I want to make sure the Council understands exactly what humanity has to offer." Over the next several hours, Sarah received a flood of data from Earth. Medical studies on human physical capabilities, psychological profiles of various human populations, historical analyses of human problem-solving abilities, and cultural surveys that demonstrated the diversity of human societies across the globe. As she reviewed the information, Sarah began to develop a strategy for the upcoming demonstration. The key would be to show the Council that human capabilities were not inherently threatening, but rather represented a unique set of tools that could benefit galactic civilization as a whole. She also spent time researching the species that would likely be represented among her assessors. Understanding their own evolutionary backgrounds and cultural values would be crucial for presenting humanity in the best possible light. The Arcturians, like Dean Thaxmore, were methodical and logical, valuing careful analysis over emotional responses. The Zephyrians were peaceful and artistic, prizing harmony and beauty above all else. The Carathians were collective thinkers who made decisions through consensus rather than individual judgment. Each species had evolved in response to different environmental pressures, and each had developed unique strengths as a result. Sarah needed to demonstrate that humanity's particular strengths could complement rather than threaten the existing galactic order. As the Academy's night cycle began and the artificial lighting dimmed to simulate planetary darkness, Sarah found herself standing on one of the observation decks, looking out at the stars that held billions of worlds populated by intelligent beings. Tomorrow, she would face trials designed to determine whether humanity deserved a place among those civilizations. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel the weight of home calling across the void. Somewhere among those stars was a small blue planet where 8 billion humans continued their daily lives, unaware that their future hung in the balance based on the actions of one young woman armed with nothing but her wits and the accumulated wisdom of her species. Sarah Chen, daughter of Earth, student of xenobiology, and reluctant representative of humanity, prepared herself for the most important test of her life. Tomorrow, she would show the galaxy what humans were truly capable of when everything they held dear was on the line. The Academy's main amphitheater had been transformed overnight into a comprehensive testing facility. Representatives from 47 different species filled the crystalline observation galleries, their varied forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes that would have been impossible to imagine before humanity's first contact with galactic civilization. Sarah Chen stood in the center of the arena, wearing her standard Academy uniform rather than any specialized equipment. The decision had been deliberate. She wanted to demonstrate that human capabilities didn't depend on advanced technology, but rather on the innate adaptability that millions of years of Deathworld evolution had embedded in her species' DNA. High Chancellor Vexrin of the Galactic Council floated above the arena in a gravity-neutral pod, her ethereal form shimmering with the bioluminescent patterns that indicated formal authority among her people. Her species, the Luminary, were considered the most advanced in known space, having achieved collective consciousness thousands of years ago while most other species were still learning to use tools. Human Sarah Chen, the Chancellor's voice resonated through both audible sound and psychic emanation. Today's assessment will evaluate your species' suitability for full membership in galactic civilization. You will face a series of scenarios designed to test not only your physical capabilities, but also your decision-making processes, ethical reasoning, and capacity for cooperation with other species. Sarah nodded respectfully, her calm demeanor hiding the nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm her. She had spent the night reviewing everything she knew about human psychology and capabilities, but no amount of preparation could truly ready someone for a test that would determine the future of their entire species. The first scenario, Chancellor Vexrin continued, will evaluate your response to environmental hazards typical of hostile worlds throughout the galaxy. The arena floor shifted and reconfigured itself, holographic projectors creating a realistic simulation of a volcanic landscape complete with active lava flows, toxic gas emissions, and unstable terrain. The temperature in the immediate area rose dramatically, and Sarah could feel the heat radiating from the artificial environment. Most galactic species would have required full environmental suits to survive in such conditions, but Sarah had grown up camping in Death Valley and hiking through the Amazon rainforest. Extreme temperatures and hostile environments were not foreign concepts to someone from Earth. She began to move through the simulation methodically, using techniques she had learned during survival training back home. When toxic gases threatened to overwhelm her, she fashioned a basic air filter from fabric torn from her uniform and activated carbon from the simulated environment. When unstable ground threatened to collapse beneath her feet, she distributed her weight and moved with the fluid grace that humans had developed for traversing difficult terrain. The observers watched in fascination as Sarah navigated challenges that would have killed most of them outright. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, showing none of the panic or confusion that typically characterized other species when faced with immediate environmental threats. "Remarkable," whispered Dr. Kethlon, the crystalline representative whose silicon-based physiology made him particularly vulnerable to the conditions Sarah was navigating with apparent ease. She's treating lethal environmental hazards as minor inconveniences. The second test introduced predatory creatures into the environment. Holographic projections of various galactic predators materialized around Sarah, each one programmed with the hunting behaviors of real creatures from worlds throughout known space. What the observers didn't understand was that Earth's predators were generally more dangerous than anything else in the galaxy. Sarah had grown up in a world where creatures like polar bears, great white sharks, and saltwater crocodiles were considered normal parts of the ecosystem. The simulated aliens were certainly impressive, but they moved and hunted in patterns that were familiar to anyone who had studied Earth's wildlife. Sarah's response demonstrated the human ability to think tactically under pressure. Rather than fighting the predators directly, she used the environment against them, creating diversions, exploiting their programmed behaviors, and eventually establishing a safe zone where she could observe and plan without immediate threat. Notice how she's not simply reacting to threats, Professor Veltar pointed out to the other observers. She's actively analyzing their behavior patterns and developing counter-strategies. This suggests high-level cognitive functioning under stress. The third test was designed to evaluate problem-solving abilities under time pressure. Sarah was presented with a series of increasingly complex puzzles that required not only logical thinking, but also intuitive leaps and creative solutions. Human brains had evolved to excel at pattern recognition and innovative thinking, traits that had allowed her ancestors to create tools, develop agriculture, and eventually achieve spaceflight despite their biological limitations. The puzzles that stumped artificial intelligences designed by species with millions of years of technological advancement fell quickly to human intuition and creativity. But it was the fourth test that truly demonstrated the gulf between human and galactic thinking. Sarah was presented with a scenario where she had to choose between saving one member of her own species or 5 members of various alien species. It was a classic ethical dilemma designed to reveal the moral framework that guided human decision-making. The observers expected her to choose based on species loyalty or utilitarian calculations. Instead, Sarah spent several minutes asking questions about the individuals involved, their ages, their family situations, their contributions to their communities, their potential for future impact. She wanted to understand who these people were as individuals rather than simply viewing them as representatives of their respective species. "I can't make this decision based on species alone," she finally said, addressing the observers directly. "On Earth, we've learned that every individual has unique value that can't be measured by simple mathematics. If I have to choose, I need to understand what each person's loss would mean to their communities and their families." Chancellor Vexrin's bioluminescent patterns shifted to configurations that Sarah had learned indicated surprise and confusion. Human Sarah, the scenario requires a definitive choice based on the information provided. Further context is not available. Sarah considered this for a moment, then looked up at the Chancellor with the kind of expression that had preceded every major advancement in human history. "Then I reject the premise of the test. In a real situation, I would find a way to save everyone or die trying. That's what humans do." The amphitheater fell silent. No one in galactic civilization had ever simply refused to accept the parameters of an ethical scenario. The concept of rejecting a no-win situation was so foreign to species that had evolved to accept limitations and work within established frameworks that they literally didn't have words for what Sarah was proposing. "Explain your reasoning," the Chancellor commanded, her patterns now showing intense interest. Sarah stood straighter, drawing on the confidence that came from representing not just herself, but the accumulated wisdom of her entire species. Every other species in the galaxy seems to have evolved to accept that some problems can't be solved, that some situations require choosing the least harmful option from a set of bad choices. Humans evolved differently. We evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill us every single day, and the only way to survive was to refuse to accept that anything was impossible. She gestured toward the simulation equipment around her. When our ancestors faced ice ages, they didn't accept extinction. They learned to make fire and build shelters. When diseases threatened to wipe out entire populations, they didn't accept death. They developed medicine. When the resources of Earth weren't enough to sustain our growing population, we didn't accept limitation. We reached for the stars. The observers were now listening with rapt attention, many of them leaning forward in their seats despite their species' typically reserved demeanor during formal proceedings. "The point isn't that humans are superior to other species," Sarah continued. "The point is that we're different. We offer something that galactic civilization has apparently lost somewhere along the way, the absolute refusal to accept that anything is truly impossible if you're willing to pay the price to change it." Chancellor Vexerin floated down closer to the arena floor, her luminescent patterns cycling through configurations that indicated deep thought. "Human Sarah, your species' philosophy is indeed unique among known civilizations. However, it could also be seen as dangerous. What happens when human determination encounters situations where acceptance and compromise are genuinely necessary?" Sarah smiled, the expression carrying warmth that seemed to light up the entire amphitheater. "Then we learn. That's the other thing humans are good at. We adapt. We've spent our entire evolutionary history learning when to fight and when to yield, when to push forward and when to step back. The difference is that we never stop believing that impossible situations can become possible if you approach them from the right angle." The final test was the most challenging yet. Sarah was required to work with a team of aliens from different species to solve a crisis scenario that threatened multiple worlds. The twist was that her teammates had been specifically chosen for their incompatibility with each other, representing species with conflicting cultural values and communication styles. This was where Sarah's human heritage truly shone. Humans had evolved as social creatures, but unlike species that had developed collective consciousness or hive minds, they had learned to navigate cooperation between individuals with different personalities, motivations, and capabilities. Sarah quickly identified the strengths and limitations of each team member, then began to facilitate communication between them in ways that respected their individual natures while working toward common goals. She mediated disputes, translated concepts between different cognitive frameworks, and gradually built a functional team from what had started as a collection of incompatible individuals. The crisis scenario was resolved not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the kind of creative cooperation that humans had been practicing since their ancestors first learned to hunt in coordinated groups. When the tests were complete, Sarah stood once again in the center of the arena, surrounded by the representatives of dozens of species whose futures would be affected by the Council's decision about humanity's place in galactic civilization. Chancellor Vexerin's patterns had settled into a configuration that Professor Veltar whispered indicated careful consideration. "Human Sarah Chen, your performance today has been illuminating. Your species possesses capabilities that are indeed unique among known civilizations." Sarah waited, knowing that the next words would determine whether humanity would be welcomed into the galactic community or forever marked as too dangerous for peaceful coexistence. "The Council finds," the Chancellor continued, "that while humans do represent a significant departure from the evolutionary patterns of other galactic species, this difference does not constitute a threat to galactic security. Rather, it represents an opportunity for mutual benefit." Relief flooded through Sarah, but the Chancellor wasn't finished. "However, humanity's integration into galactic civilization will require careful monitoring and gradual introduction. Your species' tendency to reject impossible situations could prove invaluable when facing genuine existential threats, but it must be balanced with wisdom and restraint. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was likely the best outcome she could have hoped for. Humanity would be given a chance to prove themselves, but they would have to earn full acceptance through their actions rather than simply being granted it based on potential. There is one final matter, Chancellor Vexrin said. The Council would like to offer you a position as humanity's first ambassador to galactic civilization. Your performance today has demonstrated that you understand both human nature and galactic culture well enough to serve as a bridge between our peoples. Sarah looked up at the galleries filled with representatives of species from across the galaxy, then thought about the 8 billion humans back on Earth who were counting on her to represent their best interests. Chancellor, she said, I'm honored by the offer, but I think I'd prefer to continue my studies here at the Academy. If humans are going to be successful members of galactic civilization, we'll need more than one person who understands both cultures. We'll need an entire generation of humans who can work with aliens and aliens who can work with humans. The Chancellor's patterns shifted to what Sarah had learned indicated approval. A wise perspective, human Sarah. The Academy would be honored to have you continue your studies here, and we will establish exchange programs to bring more of your people to learn about galactic civilization while sending our representatives to Earth to understand your culture. As the formal proceedings concluded and the observers began to file out of the amphitheater, Professor Veltar approached Sarah with her characteristic graceful movements. Sarah, the Zephyrian said, her melodious voice carrying notes of pride and affection, you have done something remarkable today. You have shown the galaxy that differences between species need not be sources of fear, but rather opportunities for growth and mutual enrichment. Sarah looked around at the arena where she had just determined the future of human-alien relations, then smiled with the quiet confidence that had carried her species from the caves of Africa to the stars of the galaxy. Professor, she said, I think this is just the beginning. Humans have a saying, the best way to predict the future is to create it. I have a feeling that the future of galactic civilization is going to be very interesting. And in the observation galleries above, representatives of dozens of species found themselves agreeing with the young human's assessment. The galaxy had just gained its first Deathworld species, and nothing would ever be quite the same again.